Now, the typical evolution of any policy, and the sort of policies that I've observed over a long lifetime, is we start off with ignorance of it, and if we do learn about it, we deny it exists, and therefore we don't do anything. Then we become aware of small problems that are arising because of this policy, and we make marginal actions. And then finally, we get really growing effects, often verging on disaster, after which we get bigger actions. Very rare that you get political movement before, in anticipation of the disaster, rather than after it, which is, of course, what we're trying to do this time. We're trying to do the very difficult thing of predicting disaster and saying, do it before the disaster comes. Now, you'll notice in the brilliant lunchtime speech we had, we got the optimistic view that we had the disaster and then it wasn't too late, because the disasters were there and then people were reacting. I hope you're right. I hope you're right. The timing is really tight, because there's plenty of scientists who tell me that if you wait for enough disasters to really move the public through the disaster mechanism, you'll have passed the tipping point, it'll be too late. So we have to, I think, not put our eggs in the lunchtime basket. We have to say, let's see if we can persuade people and governments to act in a big way before the disaster. But of course, it isn't going from little things to great big disasters. The disasters become a little bigger and a little bigger and a little closer together, and we want to use them. And what we need is to have a blueprint for the carbonless society, so that when people are persuaded that really big changes are needed, we're there, we can hit the ground running. If we wait until they're persuaded, then we form a bunch of committees and say, well, how do we react? Then we've lost another 5 years. So this kind of work is really important, to say, this is how we're going to hit the ground running when finally people are persuaded that we need really big changes. There are, of course, you've mentioned really big disasters that are very likely. The shift of the monsoon, the shift of the Gulf Stream make most of northern Europe uninhabitable. Loss of the water from the Himalayas. Big fish are about to disappear from Southeast Asia. The main source of protein for most people in Southeast Asia is big game fish, and they are on the road to extinction in a matter of 5 to 7 years. Now, so that there is no question that there's a good number, enough big disasters on the way, and fewer and closer storm surges, all the other things that we can think of. Okay, now there's two approaches, two things we have to do, and here's where I have a little, I think, slight difference with Guy. We can identify the problem and try to reduce the causes, eliminate them if we can. And we can deal with the effects. We can identify the effects and deal with them. Adaptive. Now, I agree with him that if we adapt and say this is all we need to do, then that's the road to disaster. But I don't see that. The reason I've helped in the founding of this was that I didn't think we were putting anything in to trying to cope in the meantime. If you don't survive the Nazi occupation, then you can't overthrow it. So you must be able to cope with what you've got now, as well as worry about the long run, removing the consequences. You will notice that there was a lot of coping in the lunchtime speech. So I agree that if coping is taken to mean you don't need to identify and reduce the causes, then it's bad. But I don't see that they have to be competitive. I think we have to say, we must, in the long run, or tomorrow, do everything we can to reduce causes. But we already, if the causes were removed tomorrow, there would be an awful lot of consequences we'd have to cope with, and we better start worrying and thinking about how to do that. I don't think the two are completely, it was often said, I don't think the two are completely, they're interdependent, but they're not the same problem. Think of the small Pacific island we just heard about, where the natives, the occupants, they live in a subsistence economy. There's nothing they can do to reduce emissions. but they got to cope. So there's a pure coping problem. So if someone says the two are identical, then that's a counterexample that says they have nothing they can do about reducing the causes, but they do have to cope. And most of us are in a situation where we have both. We have to fight the causes, and in the meantime, we have to cope. Now, big governments and NGOs, but mainly big governments, are really the main movers in removing the causes. The kind of world that our lunchtime speaker told us about was brought about to a great extent by a shift of government policy, a certain amount of private initiative inventing the technologies, but without the shift in government policy, it couldn't have happened. It's a necessary condition. We hear from the Columbia Basin, however, that smaller units can be energized to make their contribution as well. The coping is certainly more local. We can be reactive and we can be predictive. We can react to what we've already got. We can kind of predict what's going to happen and help people to cope. One of the reasons for predicting, of course, is you don't want to treat as epidemic something that's endemic. If you get an isolated flood, you can drain it and repair the dike. But if the water is rising every year and the floods are going to get worse and worse, you better do what the Dutch are doing, which is learn how to float your cities and throw away the dikes. So it's very important to predict, am I dealing with a problem that is endemic and is going to get worse, because my response to it is going to be very different than if it's an isolated problem. Excuse me. How to bring the stakeholders together. Well, we heard a lot again about the exciting work in the Columbia Basin in bringing stakeholders together. Limits, yes, there are limits to coping, but there's a great deal that can be done. You know, if the sea level is going to raise 2 meters, we can cope in a very different way than if the sea level is going to rise by 20 meters. So, and there are limits, and the limits depend upon how much we predict is going to happen in a particular aspect. Insurance, of course, I mean, a lot of talk about insurance. I'm not an insurance expert, but it depends upon independence of disasters. That my house burning down has no relation to your house burning down, and then the statistical law of large numbers allows profitable insurance. With climate change, of course, you get correlated changes. You get entire areas flooded, entire areas wiped out by hurricanes. And when this becomes repetitive, as we already heard this morning, it becomes difficult for individuals to get insurance. Gordon McBean talked a great deal, and I couldn't attempt to summarize his lovely talk this afternoon, but a great deal about what can be done at the local level was in his talk. The opportunities, I mentioned the economic opportunities from being green. We heard a great deal in the very first 2 speeches this morning about how the opportunities created by green policies can work. Okay, finally, what do I say in conclusion? We need to think big. We need to think very big, and we need to think about big problems and big solutions. But we also need to think small. We need to think small on coping. We need to think small. And one of the nice things about coping in the small thing, as we've heard here, it's a way of bringing more and more individuals. It is the people who matter in the end. And if the people can start in denial, and by then contributing in this small way that you've organized, and then slowly come around because their minds become more open, then they finally become open to realizing we got a big problem in our hands. So dealing with coping in small units is one way to change public opinion around, short of just waiting for them to be persuaded by a disaster. And that's really my final message. We need all these directions to work in. We need to think and work big. We need to operate small. We need to operate on the coping level, small, more small than big, and everybody to his own oar, and don't tell somebody else that they shouldn't be pulling on their oar as you like your